Hello everyone, my name is Will Eisenhart, and I will guide you through this unique comparison between two pillars of world religiosity. I am talking about Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth, and Buddha, or Gautama Siddhartha. The first can be seen as a pillar of Western religious sentiment, while the second is undoubtedly an essential cornerstone of Eastern religiosity. Similar to all the other videos, this will not be a discussion that contemplates places and dates, for which you are referred to the appropriate venues, but rather a conceptual analysis that equally has the ambition to ignore moral considerations. That is, it is not intended to take sides for one or the other, but rather to show their respective theoretical implications. Christ and Buddha at the origin of man's dominion over nature and spirit respectively. The figure of Jesus Christ and that of Gautama Buddha represent two fundamental pillars in the respective religious traditions of Christianity and Buddhism. Despite the evident differences between the two figures and the traditions that derive from them, both have exerted a significant influence on the way in which man perceives and dominates the natural and spiritual world. This essay aims to explore how Christ symbolizes man's dominion over nature, while Buddha represents man's dominion over the spirit. This comparison is motivated by several considerations regarding the sacred texts, the historicity, the religious background, the associated miracles and the respective struggles against evil, as well as their visions of death and salvation. The written reference of Christ is the Bible, which places man at the center of creation. In Genesis, God creates man in his image and likeness, giving him dominion over animals and the earth. This act of creation and assignment of dominion implies a relationship of superiority of man over nature, destined to rule it. In contrast, the Buddha has its roots in the Vedas and later Buddhist texts, where the tension between Atman, the divine self, and Brahman, the transcendent divine, is resolved in a profound unity. Buddhist philosophy emphasizes the overcoming of the ego and the realization of the interconnectedness of all things, promoting a dominion over interiority rather than external nature. The historicity of Christ is a debated topic. While some scholars argue for the historical existence of Jesus, others see him as a transcendent symbol rather than historically verifiable. This transcendence emphasizes Jesus' role as a mediator between man and God, emphasizing salvation that transcends the earthly world. In contrast, the historicity of the Buddha is better documented. Siddhartha Gautama lived in the 6th century before Christ, and its teaching, embodied in the Eightfold Path, is closely linked to practical life and liberation from suffering in the present world. This gives Buddhism an immanent character and oriented towards internal spiritual realization. Christianity is deeply rooted in a monotheistic transcendence, where God is a supreme entity that exists outside the earthly world. This monotheism establishes a clear distinction between the sacred and the profane, with man called to transcend worldly reality to reach God. In contrast, Buddhism emerges from a polytheistic and immanent context, where sacredness is intrinsic to reality itself. Buddhist practice seeks to recognize and experience sacredness in everyday life, dissolving the barriers between the sacred and the profane. The miracles of Christ are divine acts that intervene in nature, turning water into wine, multiplying loaves and fishes, resurrecting the dead. These miracles emphasize Christ's divine power over nature and reinforce his authority as the Son of God. In contrast, the miraculous powers attributed to the Buddha are more internal and related to the mind and body, such as telekinesis, mind reading, and levitation. These siddhis are seen as the results of deep meditation and mastery of the human interior, reflecting a spiritual rather than natural dominion. Christ's struggle with Satan is a metaphysical conflict concerning world domination and the salvation of humanity. Satan represents the external evil that must be defeated in order to restore the divine order. In contrast, the Buddha's struggle with Mara, the demon of death and temptation, is an internal battle. Mara represents the negative mental states and illusions that prevent enlightenment. The Buddha's victory over Mara is a conquest of the inner self, rather than a defeat of an external entity. Christ's death culminates in his resurrection and ascension into heaven, an event that underscores the transcendence of Christian salvation. Christ's resurrection promises eternal life beyond the earthly world, reinforcing the transcendent dimension of the Christian faith. In contrast, the Buddha's victory over death manifests itself in the attainment of nirvana, a state of peace and liberation from the cycle of birth and death that can be achieved during earthly life. Nirvana is an internal realization that transcends pain and attachment, highlighting an imminent and spiritual salvation. Christ and Buddha, although belonging to different religious and cultural contexts, represent two distinct ways of conceiving the dominion of man over nature and spirit. And by this I do not mean that Christ ever wanted to dominate nature, or Buddha the spirit. But that, for that current of thought that has become dominant in the so-called West, they represent precisely this. In other words, Christ symbolizes an external dominion, where nature is subordinate to man and salvation is transcendent. Buddha, on the other hand, embodies the internal dominion, where spiritual liberation is obtained through the mastery of interiority and immanent enlightenment. These are speculative approaches that will be explored in more detail later. For now, I will only reiterate that we are referring to that particular philosophical speculation that has imposed itself in the West over the centuries. The same one that has forged technology through a renewed vision of the sacred and the profane. To trivialize, whenever we are carrying our cross in this world believing that we will gain eternal bliss in the afterlife, we are walking the path of Christ. When, on the other hand, we are fighting against our limits to gain serenity in this world, then our referent is the Buddha. I repeat, we do not want to take sides here. The intent, it is reiterated, is to highlight the consequences both on the historical and cultural levels. In this regard, while the figure of Christ implies man's desire to dominate nature, in reality the figure of Buddha implies man's desire to dominate the interiority of the spirit. But be careful. This is not to say that Jesus ever wanted to dominate nature. Or, similarly, that Buddha wanted to dominate the spirit. Rather, that it was a certain historical current of human thought, in my opinion decisive for the fate of the planet, that interpreted them in this way.